Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming. This is the Housing, Power and Property Symposium. My name's Jeremy Gilbert. I'm one of the organisers, along with my friend Lynn and Anna here. Lynn's going to be chairing, and I'm going to speak, and so is Anna and Isaac Rose, who is come down from Manchester. Anna and I are both academics based at the university. Anna Minton is I'm sure will be known to most of you, one of the most prominent commentators on housing and housing policy in the UK today. My name's Jeremy Gilbert. I'm Professor of Cultural and Political Theory here at the university. And what is your job at the moment? You tell us.
Yeah, so I work for and have done since 2020 the Greater Manchester Tenants Union, which we kind of built up kind of in that period. I guess it's the equivalent of LIU here in London. But I'm also author of a book on Manchester and its kind of urban development housing crisis called The Rentier City.
And Anna, what was your most recent book?
So my most recent book was Big Capital, Who is London For?, which was published in 2017, so quite some time ago. And I've just finished the first draft of a new book, which will be published in, January 2027, which is taking those themes forward and is also looking very much at the impact of American policy approaches towards cities. So it's more international, and I'm not 100% sure what it's going to be called, but it might be called Super Prime, the Sterilisation of the City.
And Anna and Lynn McCarthy and myself, we're all part of we're all involved in a research centre here at the university, the Centre for Social Change and Justice. We have been also, within that, we have a kind of specialist group called the Housing Knowledge Exchange Unit. We've been working on events and various collaborative projects like this over the past couple of years. We're also, this year, we've been working with the Autonomy Institute on partly supporting a series of seminars held in Bethnal Green earlier in the year around broad issues in contemporary progressive policy. And we've all got a very strong interest, that I think everyone here has, in the issue of housing. And, okay, we agreed. I thought Anna was going to go first, but it turns out I'm going to go first.
I can if you want.
No, it's fine. I don't mind. I don't want people to think, oh, he's organised the thing. He's introducing the session and he's putting himself first. What a wanker. So, that's the... yeah, so what I'm going to talk about is a sort of potential conceptual frame for the day in a way. I co-authored a book with Alex Williams called Hegemony Now that came out in 2022. I think it's published by Verso, and we wanted it to be called Hegemony Now, Power in the 21st Century, but they said it had to have a more accessible title. So it's how big tech and Wall Street won the world became the subtitle. And it's a very general account of how we understand that shifting power relations really on a global scale over the past few decades and at the current moment. And one of the tropes in that book, which we like to explore, is focused on the question, who won the 20th century? So we have this whole spiel, which we're very proud of, we think it's very clever, saying like, who actually won the 20th century? In other words, if you look at the key social, cultural, political conflicts of the latter period of the 20th century, really going back to the crisis of the early 70s, who actually won? And our argument is, well, who won is primarily Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs, probably secondarily the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China, and thirdly, the finance capital, basically. They're the people, if you asked them in 1971, what kind of world do you want? 30 years from now, they got the world they wanted. Like conservatives didn't really get the world they wanted at all. But people on the left didn't get the world they wanted. If you'd have asked almost any member of the American elite or establishment in 1972, do you want a world in which pretty much the entire industrial capacity of the world has moved to China? They'd have said, no, we don't want that. But that is what they got. But who would have said, yeah, I'm fine with that, would have been a young Steve Jobs. And they got what they wanted. So that's how we frame that question, the question of who really exercises a kind of leadership over the capitalist class more broadly and over societies more generally. The book is partly framed around this concept of hegemony, which we always say is best defined as the capacity of particular social groups to occupy a kind of position of leadership over a society, a country, even a whole planet. And what we mean by leadership is just in the most literal terms, to do what a leader does in the most basic geometric terms, to generally determine a direction of travel. And it's the capacity of particular social groups to determine a direction of travel, which we mean by hegemony. Does that make sense? And so we're very proud we were very kind of pleased with this formulation. And then we held a launch for the book at the World Transformed, the kind of left-wing political festival in Liverpool in 2022, and had a really good session. I think you were there, weren't you, Isaac? And somebody in the room asked a really good question. They said, if you had been writing this book not from this sort of global stroke transatlantic perspective, if instead you had written it about just Britain, would you have given the same answer to the question, who won the 20th century? I thought that's a really good question. I thought, no, I wouldn't have given the same. The answer, who won the 20th century in Britain, is landlords. That's the answer I would give. And I would have forgotten about that because Isaac mentioned it in his book. So I was kind of stuck with that as an idea. So that's kind of a kind of idea I want to think about here, to sort of explore that, and think for a little bit about what that means. Because I think it's a pretty robust frame. You can poke holes in it if you really want to, but I think it's a pretty robust framework for understanding political, cultural, and social and economic change in Britain over the past few decades. To say that, basically, the people who've got the most of what they wanted, the people who've got the sort of class, the class fraction, if you will, the section of the capitalist class, who've actually had the most power and the most authority, have been, I would say, landlords and property developers. Now, it doesn't mean that they have actually have necessarily generated the most overall profit. I would say I did check this, and I think technically, if you invested enough money in stocks and shares rather than property, rental property, at some point over the past 20 to 30 years, you'd have made more money from stocks and shares. You'd normally make more money from almost anything. I mean, arguably, it's a default position of a capitalist society. You're going to make more money from the stock market than you are from any other source over a long enough period of time. But that's not the only measure of power and authority in a capitalist or any other kind of society. From my point of view, it's the fact that the society is organised to maximise the profitability of shares on the stock market. That's not a new thing. That's a pretty much invariant feature of a capitalist society for as long as there has been such a thing, and certainly since the mid-19th century. But taking that as a given, I would say the extent to which things have been organised in a way which have benefited asset holders, and in particular holders of large numbers of assets, and in particular holders of large quantities of assets to which other people need access, the extent to which things have been organised such as to benefit those people in very specific ways is really significant. And I would say, in particular, if we think about the things that have changed rather than things that have basically stayed the same, really over the past 40 years, then we can say that no group has really benefited more socially, politically, so culturally, and above all economically, than landlords and property developers. Certainly, there's no question that profits and capital gains from owning rental properties and speculating on property values over the past few decades has been hugely profitable. There's no question of that. But I think more fundamentally, in a way, that firstly, a whole series of policy decisions have been taken over the past few decades, which have absolutely sort of shored up the value of assets and property assets, have pushed up property values, have ensured that people who hold property are treated very well, and people who don't are treated increasingly badly. Ever since, as I say, the early 1980s. As I'm sure we all know, obviously the critical moment is the period of the Thatcher government, the right to buy programme, the closing down of local authority house building programmes, and the deregulation of rents and the effective abolition of anything like a civilised framework for protecting tenants' rights in the late 80s really amount to a situation, as we all know, really a charter for landlords to make as much money as possible. But at the same time, there's a whole series of other things happening over the course of the 90s that really exacerbate the situation, none of which were inevitable, none of which had to happen. The question of to what extent real wages grow or don't grow over a period like that is always really contentious among economic historians, because wages become very difficult to compare between different historical periods. Some economic historians would say real wages actually don't grow at all in real terms from the late 70s. That's contentious. But what isn't contentious is that wages as a portion of GDP should go down. So basically the amount of the overall profit the economy is generating going into workers' pay packets declines from the late 70s and never recovers. And significantly, over the course of the 1990s then, people's capacity to participate in the consumer economy is increasingly dependent on their access to credit as opposed to their wage levels. And access to credit is really massively expanded on the basis of two mechanisms. Personal debt, which is really facilitated through technologies like credit cards, etc. Something we say in the book Hegemony Now, actually. I don't think nearly enough attention is often paid in our understanding of that history to the technology of the credit card and the way it really enables a completely different relationship to personal debt, private debt. But another key factor driving massively increased and inflated private and household debt has been people borrowing against the rising asset values of their homes and this has really effectively compensated for people's what would have otherwise been quite significant real terms declines in spending power for quite large portions of the workforce over the 90s and 2000s. I mean, just the simple illustration of that is the anecdotal fact that I'm sure lots of us will know people, I would say especially people sort of my age, my generation, who would have come into the labour and property markets in the 90s or the early 2000s, who've effectively made more money over the course of their working lives from the value of their flat going up than they have from wages and salaries. So that is a really significant shift. I think at the same time, this has obviously had hugely significant impact on the way we live. I mean, one of the reasons in the book Hegemony Now we really focused on Silicon Valley as a hegemonic force globally is, well, in my experience over the past, I've been teaching sort of cultural studies and contemporary sociology and contemporary history for decades. And I think from the very first day I started teaching undergraduates in the mid-90s right to the present, I always like to ask students, well, what is it that defines our time? What is it that you think makes our time different from the past? And up until sometime in the early 2000s, they would the main thing they would focus on is changing social and cultural attitudes, changing attitudes to gender, multiculturalism. But from about sort of 2005, the thing they would always talk about is the internet, smartphones, etc. And that's still the case absolutely today. People's sense of what it is that makes our time is the things that have been done by Silicon Valley. But again, I would say you could make a very good argument, and I would say increasingly, if I ask that question to young people, one of the first things they'll mention is the complete inaccessibility of the housing market. They'll mention rent. Yeah, the rent is too high. What you could do that we can't do is expect to leave home in your early 20s and go rent a house with your friends, like even in a big city. So there's a real sense that this has changed the way people live, that it changes people's whole relationship to the economic world, to the labour market. It changes, to some extent, people's social subjectivity. At the same time, there's obviously been a really concerted effort across the culture, to a large extent, to incorporate a majority of the adult population into a society, into a set of social and cultural arrangements and norms, according to which really it's your status as a homeowner which pretty much defines you as a functioning citizen, as a functioning participant in the culture, and which is really it's the key aspiration which marks whether you've reached a certain level of security or not, and it's the thing which really again defines your relationship to the socio-economic world. I think you can really get a sense, and I think you can obviously see this in things like the popularity of TV shows about property, which is a kind of, when it first starts to happen in the late 90s, is kind of shocking. Like, why do people want to watch TV shows about property values? But it's sort of persists for quite a long time. And I think it's also, at the same time, I would say, it's as homeowners that crucial sections of the population have been largely recruited into political acquiescence with a set of social and economic arrangements which have clearly been having deleterious effects on large portions of the population for many years. I mean, I think if you want to understand like what has changed in British politics and culture just over the past 4 years, the absolute key thing that has changed is this. Between 2008, 2010, and really sort of 2022, for about 12 years, although it was quite clear that economic conditions were really deteriorating for young people in particular, for pretty much anyone, for anyone working in the public sector, for anyone highly dependent on public services, for their education, their health, etc., a really significant section of the population was insulated from any real understanding of that situation by incredibly low interest rates. Interest rates were kept incredibly low, which basically meant, I mean, to put it really crudely, as a sort of Gen X member of the professional classes, like people who didn't work in the public sector didn't really understand what was happening, basically. And so, for example, Brexit comes as a massive shock to these people because they have no idea how unhappy people are in other sections of the population because they've been highly insulated by just ridiculously low interest rates, which basically enable people to maintain like a middle-class affluent lifestyle, sort of typical of the early 21st century, under economic conditions where anybody maintaining that lifestyle is just quite implausible. Well, that's gone. That's what's gone in the past 3 years, and it's had a catastrophic knock-on effect across the. That's why we're now in a completely unprecedented situation politically, where the Conservative and Labour parties between them are commanding support of about a third of the electorate, which is completely unheard of. That's the key thing that's changed. So, I think at the same time, of course, it's also the extraordinary privileges which have been accorded to a particular generation of homeowners, really the baby boomers, which have also secured their support for an extremely conservative political agenda, very broadly, for the most part, in ways which again have had really significant political effects. Now, if it weren't for the fact that voters over 60 are very likely to turn out to vote and have been largely recruited to very conservative political projects, we wouldn't have seen the Brexit result. The Tories wouldn't have won the elections they won in 2015 and 2017 and 2019, and in fact, the current government would not be sort of would not feel so beholden to an extremely conservative agenda. So in all these and all of this is ultimately arranged, to a particular material and economic end. All of this is arranged to avoid a particular set of outcomes, and that particular set of outcomes is that it's all designed to avoid at any possible cost is declining asset values, is anything that might suppress house prices, basically, because so much has now been built on rising house prices as the thing which gives old people a sense of security. It gives middle-aged people a sense that, well, even though the pensions got trashed in the early 21st century without anybody even noticing, and even though their own kids don't look like they have very good prospects, well, at least they have a high-value asset, which will mean they can retire in safety, and at least the kids can live with them if they have to. So much has been invested in that the political class is quite terrified of undertaking any measure which leads to a decline in house prices, basically, I think. But it's almost impossible to conceive of a situation which could resolve any of the negative outcomes I've been describing, which doesn't do that, which presents us with a real impasse. But that is what I mean when I talk about that. If you like, the hegemony of landlords and developers. To this, they might not be popular. Everybody hates them. But as of this moment, even a Labour government supposedly committed to a house building programme, etc., is not really willing to do anything which is seen to contradict the interests of developers and property owners, arguably. Okay, I've talked enough about that. I think I've made the point. Thanks very much. Your go.
My go. Okay, thank you, Jeremy. So I've just prepared some quite informal remarks. I'm not quite sure how long I will speak for. It depends if I sort of get going. And I was going to start really by saying that I was going to bookend my remarks with the context when I wrote Big Capital in 2017 and the current context now, which I hadn't expected was going to transform quite as much as it did. But I think coming just after Jeremy, there's a little provocation in there for me that I also just want to throw into the mix. And it was this interesting question at The World Transformed, where he was asked, if you were writing about the UK, would you say the same thing? And Jeremy said, no, I wouldn't. I'd say it was all about landlords here. And so my new book looks at North America, and it looks very much at the impact of American policies on, that whole field we'd vaguely call urbanism. So I travelled a lot to the States for the book and, thought about that quite a lot. And I have to say, I think it's very much landlords in America as well. I don't think it's the sort of intersection of tech and real estate and, this area that, is increasingly being called prop tech. So, yeah, we don't have the tech piece over here in the UK, and any, nascent shoots of that tech piece, we just give it to them anyway. But over there, they have that intersection, very much as well. So I just thought I'd sort of, bring that in before I got going. So yeah, I mean, when I wrote Big Capital, like the main theme was that this city, I came out in 2017, and the main theme was that this was the post-crash city. This luxury apartment building that you could see anywhere you went, it was something that we had started to see after the 2008 crash. And, Big Capital was this very self-conscious play on Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, the theme being that the income from economic rent is greater than than the income from growth or wages. That point that Jeremy and I, my generation, if we were lucky enough to buy somewhere, earn far more from that than we do by going to work, and that combined with the 2008 crash in terms of monetary policy. Jeremy's already mentioned interest rates. That was a really big part of the cheap money picture. But the other absolutely critical element was quantitative easing. So, that the solution to save the financial system in 2008, that's the cause of the problem, and the creation of trillions of pounds and dollars of new money inflated asset prices throughout the system. And that ran from 2008 to 2016, that program of quantitative easing. And it created a really, transformed financial picture. And that was very much part of how I saw that city, which was created and which I wrote about in Big Capital. And it was obviously not just in London, in other British cities, in the US, in North America, Australia, a little bit less extreme in Europe, but, it was that post-crash picture. And I've thought about that a little bit more in my new book, and I've talked about how the subprime crisis actually gave rise to this superprime crisis, where I sort of define superprime as being this financialization which came with monetary policy and quantitative easing. So that's when Big Capital came out, and it was about all the luxury apartments that nobody could afford to live in. And I think someone in the audience said, oh yeah, last time I saw you, you were talking about safety deposit boxes in the sky, and that type of city economy. And since then, we've also had the pandemic. And I think something which isn't noted that much is that actually during, I think, just 1 year, or it might be 2 years, I haven't got the figures, of the pandemic, the same amount of quantitative easing was unleashed into the economy as in the 6 years between 2008 to 2016. And that had a huge impact. And I mean, these trends are also playing out, meanwhile, in North America, particularly in the US, and we're starting to see the takeover of real estate by different financialized actors. And I know that Isaac's going to come out, I think I'm sitting quite well between them, actually, because this is going to be a good segue into some of them. I suspect you might mention some of these financialized actors and the takeover by private equity, private equity giants like Blackstone and, various other public-private partnerships, which are basically, they've carved up the city beneath us, and, we can't see that, but they are today's landlords. So that's the sort of the broad picture. I mean, depending on how much time I've got, I can also say a little bit about how the picture I was writing about before was this endless building of luxury apartments. It was just unstoppable. No affordable housing, because obviously nobody, could afford to live in those homes. They were sold off-plan before they were even built to investors in the Far East, in Asia. A lot of them were empty, but it was constant, the building. And you sort of thought it would never stop, the speculative model. But actually, it stopped. Now, you might not really be aware of it because there are still lots of construction sites in the city and there are still a lot of hoardings, but there's a lag. Sites are still being built out, but people are not buying, nothing is coming on stream, and there is no building in London. Manchester, a little bit different. Other cities, a little bit different. Nobody's building in London. The bottom has completely fallen out of that model. And that's partly driving the government's planning reforms and alleged claims that they're going to build 1.5 million new homes because, hey, all those apartments are so useful. They're going to build a whole lot more by loosening the planning system. Well, the reason nobody's not building is it's not really driven by the planning system. What it's driven by is profit. And it's no longer profitable for developers to build in London, and a big reason for that is because the investors have gone. And they've gone because of Brexit, they've gone because of construction costs, which are associated with Brexit. So that model has come to a halt. So now we're in this kind of ironic situation where the government is desperate to get building again. The developers don't want to really build. It's not a question of affordable homes, because those schemes were not delivering affordable homes anyway, but it is actually a question of growth, because construction does generate GDP, and that's another of their mantras. So we've got into this situation where we're starting possibly to get those luxury apartment developments getting the green light, even though everyone knows they're not going to provide any affordable homes, and even though they might be very damaging to communities. I was just involved with a public inquiry in Rye Lane for anyone who knows that particular scheme, but it may well get the green light so that it can be seen as part of the picture of the government's planning reforms achieving something. So, I mean, I've gone it feels like I had a kind of macro picture, and I've gone a little bit detailed, but the point I was trying to convey is that we're actually not building anymore, But in Manchester, I think there is still, I mean, you're probably going to say something about this. There is still a lot of this type of speculative building going on, which is being pushed by, a variety of financial actors. And I'm going to come to an end in a minute, but just something that interests me about Manchester is that it's a very paradoxical place, it seems to me. I mean, I was lucky enough when I was in Manchester to be shown around the city by Isaac himself on a very, very hot day. And I was up there because I was wanting to look at Manchester and Salford for my new book, for a chapter that I've called A Tale of Two Cities. And I'd looked at it in a book I'd written in 2009 called Ground Control, and I wanted to revisit it. And so Isaac took me around all of these spanking brand new privatised developments like New Islington Marina and various others. And I was really struck by Manchester being so chock full of this sort of uber development. And yet at the same time, you've got Andy Burnham, King of the North, Manchester Land Commission, actually doing some genuinely quite good things as with regards to transport, and presenting himself very much to the left of, well, some of the, not exactly left, but you know what I mean. And it's like, how can you really do that when you're mayor of Manchester? So that's a sort of interesting paradoxical point. And then my final point would be on Manchester, just having experienced like those really sharp divisions, between Manchester, different parts of Manchester, and then sort of going into Salford, and some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country, and just, utterly different worlds which are side by side with each other. And, in the book, I do try to draw parallels between that stark polarization and the rise of the far right and the populist climate that we increasingly find ourselves in. So I've done exactly what I tell students never to do, which is like finish on a new point. But yeah, maybe some of this will segue into what you're going to speak about, Isaac.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I'm actually. Well, I will talk a bit about Manchester, but maybe if we want to talk more about Manchester, we can also talk about Manchester in a wider discussion. And also, I'm sure Charlie, who's speaking later on, will talk a bit about Greater Manchester, Salford in particular, and that kind of stuff. But I just kind of wanted to lay out a bit of some general thoughts and some Manchester thoughts. So yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be able to share the platform today with so many people who I have thought with and organised with over the last decade, and I think that's across the day. It really feels in recent years that the politics of housing has finally broken into the mainstream as the kind of crisis or catastrophe has risen to be one of the primary political concerns of our time. Though I would argue that a truly radical politics of urban space that can inform tenant and wider organising is still missing among the left. So I wanted to think about this question: is Britain ruled by rentiers? And back in the pandemic, as landlords were given what we came to talk about as a double subsidy, which was a freeze on mortgage payments and the protection of rental income through the furlough, I was part of a group of writers and organisers who kind of came together to think about this question via semi-regular Zoom calls and collective writing. And one of us, the writer economist Joe Billsborough, coined this pithy phrase that's always stuck with me, that Britain was or is a housing market with an economy attached. And Nick Bano, who is speaking later and who is also part of our little crew, will I'm sure talk about some of the mechanics by which this came to be over the last 40 years. And I remember at the time he also memorably lampooned Conservative government's pandemic economic strategy as one that was determined to keep the housing casino rolling. It was Joe's idea of the economy with the housing, economy with the adjunct as the adjunct to the housing market, which has always seemed to me as a very highly illuminating way of understanding our contemporary situation. And it seems clear that housing and the land are critical to the rentierised economy of Britain, not just in terms of flows of surpluses, but also, as Jeremy has kind of talked about, the political basis that underpin the governing bloc. Economic strategy appears to have two key goals among it: ensuring that the real estate industry in the cities keeps moving, with ever more land and subsidy made available to feed what David Harvey termed the downtown monster, while at the same time ensuring house prices across the board continue in their inflationary spiral, locking millions into the system as both beneficiaries but also dependents, and a political base of homeowners and landlords whose personal financial stability, and thus, I think, Britain's political stability, is dependent on that casino keeping rolling. And it's a really complex picture and feels like a slightly unpickable Gordian knot. But I think it's worth drawing some of these wider pictures out. So Brett Christophers has provided us with the analysis that shows that the UK today is a really paradigmatic example of a rentier economy, an economy where surplus is being drawn through the ownership of assets rather than through production. This is a kind of general trend across the capitalist system in the global north, but that Britain itself is kind of the paradigmatic example. And he argues as well that this is one that was deliberately constructed, the outcome of changes wrought by Thatcher and her successors, right to buy, mortgage credit, the Big Bang, the Housing Act, and so on, and then later on into buy-to-let mortgages, and I think also stock transfers and in the social housing sector is an unappreciated part of this story. But I think there's also something else that's really worth thinking about within the global economy over the last 5 decades, which has kind of gifted us this situation we find ourselves in today. And I think, and my book is kind of structured through this idea of the idea of capital switching. So this is an idea that comes from Henri Lefebvre, the French Marxist philosopher, whose work in 1970, The Urban Revolution, presciently analysed, I think, how the production of space would become increasingly fundamental to capitalist accumulation. And as capital ran out of profitable accumulation strategies, he wrote it would find new inspiration in the conquest of space, in real estate speculation, capital projects inside and outside the city, the buying and selling of space. And it would do so on a worldwide scale. He wrote this in 1970. I think that was the basis of Harvey's kind of work in the 80s around this kind of stuff. And kind of central to this project, or this kind of understanding, was a general shift or switch of capital circulation from the kind of primary sector of industry into a secondary sector of land, real estate, housing, and the built environment. And in the context of declining profitability in that primary sector, capital found refuge in this supplementary and complementary territory for exploitation, in his terms. Urbanization essentially becomes a substitute for industrialization. And I think this is clearly the case in Britain, a country that no longer makes stuff, but via the City of London maintains a balance of payment through the financial flows. And much of this capital ends up fixed in our cities through the new landscapes of housing and real estate and rent. And my colleague, actually Ben Beach, put this really memorably to me a couple of weeks ago. that our cities, and particularly the public land, council estate and working renters, have become, in his terms, the primary feedstock for the British economy writ large, propping up the entire economy's balance of payments and currency. And my work in Manchester really takes that story and that kind of broad picture and kind of grounds it in one place, in a path-dependent trajectory in one city. And I find Manchester as a case study really fascinating, you know, not just because I've lived there for a decade, but and kind of seen some of this stuff really just unfold before me, but also because of its history, you know, and the book kind of traces this from the historic centre of a kind of global industrial and colonial economy to today, this kind of bright spot of real estate speculation in the north of England that is also plugged in again into a global economy of finance flows into pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. And that kind of story of the city actually seems to track really, really well this story of the capital switch from the kind of primary industrial circuit into a secondary sphere of real estate speculation. But I think also what's really interesting about, if you take the story of Manchester and other cities in Britain, of course, and you draw that back, you know, in my case of Manchester, back to the birth of that city in the kind of first birth of urbanisation, its shock city phase, as Asa Briggs, the historian, kind of memorably talks about Victorian Manchester. That is also a city that was the built environment, although the kind of primary motor of the economy was factory production. The built environment of that city was built by speculative investment, by landlordism and landlords. And that was true both for the slums of Little Island, where landlords would buy strips of land and pack in as many people as possible into tiny, you know, terraced houses, but also the suburbs of Whalley Range, where the bourgeoisie of the city speculatively built suburbs in you know, out of the kind of inner city, away from the working class, and basically provided one of those early patterns of suburbanization that, you know, in the 20th century, particularly in America, becomes so common. And both in the slums and the suburbs, I think we can see, you know, the rentier, the land speculator, the landlord as a really kind of prominent figure within the building of that built environment. And that is the kind of world, and, you know, and that is the social crisis that emerges out of that world that ends up in the kind of late Victorian reform and slum clearance and ultimately public house building. It's kind of out of that original rentier city that the kind of social democratic settlement of the 20th century is built. And the rentier, you know, you could say, is euthanized in land and housing. And so by drawing that story back and beyond the kind of typical, I think, often way we think about the housing crisis as just from, you know, Thatcher onwards, but kind of taking a 200-year span, it appears much more that the 20th century, I think, is a period of aberration in this kind of longer story of the rule of rentiers in our cities. And today, I think we live among the return, or we could say revenge, of the rentier city. And I think Britain is ruled by rentiers today as it was before, aside from that brief period of euthanasia through public housing and democratic planning in the 20th century. And I think, for me, that argument really links with the work Nick's done on the resuscitation of the private landlord. It's this very similar story of private landlordism kind of almost killed in the middle of the 20th century and then brought back to life very deliberately from the late 1970s onwards. And I think, crucially, this was not like a predetermined outcome, but a deeply political project that was made possible by the result of the defeats inflicted on the left and the working class in the 1980s. And I think the triumph of the rentier emerges from the defeats of its opponents, which is local government, the labour movement, and the inner city working class particularly. And my book traces that story in the context of Manchester and how the new left leadership of the 1980s came to kind of embrace, by the end of the decade, the Thatcherite urban entrepreneurial agenda, but in the context of successive waves of defeat. 1981 and the inner city uprisings, 1984 the miners' strikes, 1985 the rate capping rebellion, and 1987 Thatcher's third election victory. In this kind of context, a new hegemonic direction of travel, kind of what Jeremy spoke about, kind of emerged, and the constrained choices of the local state were kind of faced up to by the leaders of the city and opened up a new trajectory. And in Manchester, the story is tied up with, what Owen Haverley has termed this post-rave urban growth coalition. The very clever branding and marketing of the city, both its kind of music and its sport, but also I think the kind of coming together basically of an urban elite, the kind of private sector leadership concentrated in sections of industry and elements of the local state that were more kind of attuned to this new wave of direction coming from Whitehall into this, developing this very strong and firm practice of public-private partnerships, growth, coalitions, seeking out public grant and ultimately private capital to remake sections of the city again and again, but do it on the terms of a kind of public-private partnership. And the Manchester case, I think, is notable because it's held up as a real success story and certainly kind of on one level, on its own terms, the leaders of Manchester were able to do this in a very successful way. But, my work and the work of lots of people I work with in Manchester critiques the kind of outcomes of that in terms of gentrification and rent increases and social cleansing and so on. Well, that's kind of the Manchester context that kind of emerges out of this moment of political defeat. But I think that's not unique to Manchester, but obviously common across our cities, and the decomposition of the local state and the smoothing of the routes for capital investment via these kind of technical mechanisms such as development corporations and enterprise zones were obviously pioneered here in East London. And I think to allay the idea that this was merely a technical exercise in the pursuit of growth or kind of post-industrial economic strategy, it's worth remembering that Heseltine was able to persuade Thatcher ultimately to back the Urban Development Corporation, the Docklands, because he told her it would be the way to defeat the communists in local government in East London. So I think returning to this question of who won the 20th century, I think it really is clear, to me at least, and I think it's a really good provocation from Jeremy and Alex's book, that it is landlords and real estate speculators and the wider kind of property lobby. And I think rentierism and home ownership and also gentrification have been kind of marshalled in order to build out this hegemonic block of popular support for this kind of direction of travel, but also crucially, I think, to discipline those sections of society where resistance might emerge, as it previously did. And I think here it's really worth thinking of gentrification in and of itself as a political strategy to kind of decompose as oppositional forces, as state regeneration. It decomposes working class bases of power and empowers, the rentier and the speculator and the landlord. And I think that's something that is really worth thinking more about. But I kind of want to end really briefly about what we might do about it. And this will obviously go on into the conversations later today. But I think a lot of my work over this last decade has been concerned with the kind of building of a housing and tenants movement. I was kind of clearing through some old boxes and I found a flyer for the first Greater Manchester Housing Action event I went to in April 2016, and I felt quite old, and 10 years of work. But I think, cities are battlefields. I think there's a really nice Walter Benjamin quote where he says this, and I think there is really an urgent need to recompose the forces on our side of this field. And I think this question of resistance will dominate the second half of the day. But I really want to offer just one thought on this, and what the politics of that resistance kind of going forward should be. And I think what I find really useful, the Scottish theorist Neil Gray's work on kind of urban spatial composition, which he basically argues that if urbanisation has become kind of increasingly central to capital accumulation strategies, then a kind of left anti-capitalist politics must have at its heart a kind of politics of space that is, commensurate with the current conjuncture we're in, which is dominated by rentier capitalism. So in other words, I think we need to move beyond, move beyond kind of seeing housing and urban space and urban struggle as a kind of secondary preoccupation for the broader left. But also within kind of tenant struggles, I think moving beyond this idea of just the antagonism between the tenant and the landlord to understand a much more structural, kind of systemic issue. And then also beyond that, moving these battles that, there are many battles going on in London right now, in Manchester and so on. But moving beyond the kind of militant particularisms of those single blocks or estates, against one particular scheme. I mean, I'm very inspired by the stuff in Peckham at the moment. But I think we need to be able to kind of generalize that and scale that up and link this and try and rebuild a sort of general force, and this kind of, the book ends on this idea of what is that general force that might, strike back and reclaim our cities. So yeah, thanks.
we opening the floor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so great, there you go.
Do I just speak?
Do you want it? Yeah, go on.
Hi, thanks for the talk, everyone. It was very inspiring. I mean, am I allowed to do points of information or just like mild critique? Just on the QE point of like QE creating the trillions. As a technical point, I would argue that the banks had already created those trillions of pounds beforehand, and QE and monetary policy post-08 was a strategy to maintain the kind of phantom money that this system had already created. Right, so if you follow, say, like M4 deposits or anything like that, you can see the money supply rapidly growing, like up to 2008 and leveling off post 2008. So I guess if to kind of digest this, I think critiquing both the role of the central banks but also the private banks in this, and I know Isaac mentioned the financial Big Bang, I think is an important context, and furthermore, maybe considering joint monetary and land reform would be a way forward.
Do you want to respond?
I mean, I could say something quick. I mean, you know, QE is a just mind-blowingly complicated area. And I mean, I think what it's got in common, I think what financialization has in common with the subprime crisis is that nobody can understand any of it. Well, it's a sort of simplistic way of explaining it is the process of creating new money, but it's not actually creating new money. It's the central bank, like writing, literally. Well, I mean, I try to explain this in my book, and I don't want to sort of misspeak, but it's literally they write up both sides of the balance sheet, which is why I wonder when you said, you know, they'd already done it. I would possibly quibble that sort of they'd already done it.
The private banks had already overextended the liability side of their balance sheets, and QE was trying effectively easing the liquidity position of these banks, therefore legitimizing or allowing this money to exist in the system. And if left alone, what we would have expected to see is kind of a spiraling down or a deflationary spiral from the kind of Ponzi finance pyramid that existed. So effectively, QE, as I'm proposing, was a policy to keep that kind of house of cards up, as opposed to the thing that created the.
Yeah, I mean, it was a way of ensuring, you know, more institutions like Lehman Brothers didn't go to the wall. But yeah, it's horribly complicated, and I don't know if I've managed to explain it, you know, in an intelligible way. I don't want to repeat it here without any notes.
Did you want to respond?
No.
Thanks to everyone for their contributions. Anna, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why investor demand for super prime properties in London collapsed. The way you describe it seems like it's quite like a dramatic collapse. I think you mentioned Brexit and construction costs, but can you just go into a bit more detail? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can underestimate, like, the impact of Brexit on, you know, on foreign investment. I mean, it's been absolutely huge, and political stability has been one of the really big reasons that, you know, people have wanted to invest in this country traditionally. And yeah, I mean, how can I say more about it? I mean, investors do not want to come. It's made it really, really difficult for them. Then there's the whole kind of student situation around immigration and, you know, making it a lot more difficult for foreign students. So that's tied into that market as well, because quite a lot of Far Eastern investors would have been doing two things at the same time. They may have been buying property for their son or daughter to live in while they were studying in London, and then also keeping it for, you know, speculative purposes. So, you know, the foreign student market has dropped through the floor, but those developments are very much a type of upscale student accommodation as well. So, there's the student accommodation side of it. There's the sort of general Brexit side of it. There's construction costs, which is another part of the, you know, the Brexit picture, with all the sort of extra costs imposed by having left the customs union. So I think all of that has come to, I've probably missed out some sort of key reasons, but what we know is that investors are not interested anymore in London. I think they are more interested in Manchester. I mean, London has also built far too much. You know, it was inevitable that this was going to happen. You know, they just built and built and built. And now there's, you know, tens of thousands of unsold homes.
They built one type of thing as well.
Yeah.
They built quite small luxury flats, which eventually the market for those was going to get saturated, if that's all you build.
And Rachel Reeves has said something in the budget about investment and really kind of emphasising that they want it. So, yeah,
They might want it.
Thank you. Some quick questions. Has Wales been more successful at building homes where they don't have right to buy? Where I live in Hackney, the Labour Council promised to build 1,000 homes from 22, and they're not going to get anywhere near that. This is how desperate and pathetic things are. We have 13,000 people on the waiting list, 5,000 people in temporary accommodation, and we can't even build 1,000. How successful or not has Sadiq Khan been? You've got the madness of the Big Issue article a few weeks ago saying that councils are buying back council homes and then they're being that sold back again. That's the sort of madness. Can Khan not do much about it, or is he just inept?
who's answering that?
I think we can all talk to that briefly. I think the issue of local government is really crucial to understanding how all these things are connected. And for me, the crucial thing to understand about local government is you ask the question, can Khan do anything about it? The answer is not really. And it's how constrained local government is in this country. Local government's capacity for self-determination and their capacity to vary taxes locally is like, there's almost nowhere in the world that is considered like a liberal democracy that has that level of little power. So I keep saying this to people, I keep saying this to people in Hackney, actually. I mean, I live in Waltham Forest, but it's the same everywhere, that, look, at the end of the day, like we all don't want our councils to be in bed with developers and like constantly doing deals with developers to sell off public land, to sell off housing stock, to not building social housing or affordable housing, but they're left with nothing else to do to keep the lights on in the schools and to meet their legal requirements around special needs education and around looking after the most vulnerable children. So I think there's, local government is in an absolute crisis, actually, and it's really striking that, there was probably, I think if we'd held an event about local government, that we'd have had less interest than an event about housing. Kind of everybody understands right now housing's a big issue, we're all concerned with it. But local government is an abject crisis. Like, I'm working in a university, and local government is worse than universities. It's a complete bloodbath. It's a complete disaster. And like the fact that isn't talked about at all, it's not front page news, it's not in the press, it's not in the national news. And generally speaking, the level of comprehension for the general public about local government, or what isn't within their power, what isn't their responsibilities is catastrophically poor. It's a complete disaster. And that, of course, but that all contributes. Who benefits from that? We know the answer. Who benefits from that more than anyone is property speculators and developers.
Yeah, on local government, there's a link, obviously, with housing as well, because, local authorities are so cash strapped, and they've seen their funding slashed by 40%, and they've got these enormous temporary accommodation bills to pay, which is what tipped quite a number of them into bankruptcy. So you've got the whole sort of benefit financing as well, which is probably equally, almost as complicated as monetary policy. And, just impenetrable for people. Just on your right to buy point, I don't know too much about Wales. I mean, Wales and Scotland don't have right to buy, and I can just only say that's a really, really good thing, and it's absolutely ridiculous that England still does. And it's just, I mean, it's a sort of a shibboleth of the last, 40 years that England won't get rid of right to buy, when it's so obviously a completely paradoxical policy that's undermining what, councils have started to build very small amounts of council housing, like Southwark has. But, given right to buy, it's an absolutely ridiculous situation.
Just to add to the local government thing, the mayor also is very, very constrained. The mayor of London, the GLA Act in 1999 is incredibly pathetic little powers that is given. On the we're not getting the money in. It's interesting that the mayor and the boroughs are all trying to they go to MIPIM, they try to get £22 billion in from something called Opportunity London. I don't know if any of it's come in. In Waterloo, the area that I'm operating, we've got the equivalent of 6 shards of development approved, but all on hold. And they've been on hold for the last few years. So the machine has stopped. The speculative house building machine has stopped. But it's a machine that requires that it keeps on going. And they've bought land. This is part of what goes on, is that planning policies that allow for densification increase the value of land, and they buy it ahead of the speculative house builders buy it ahead of, and carve it up and control it. Well, if the machine stops, are they not going to go bust? Are the land values not going to go down? Is there not a potential win here? If only we could get some sort of political grab of this potential. I'm obviously as sceptical as anyone else about that.
I mean, I can say just a little bit. I mean, you're right. You'd have thought, the machine has stopped. The market will respond accordingly. What seems to have happened is just paralysis. Nothing is happening. But, when you have house builders who, like last year, made such huge profits and gave back such enormous dividends, they've still got a lot of cushioning. They're nowhere near going bust, so they're just waiting until the situation becomes profitable for them again. And this is where the planning reforms come in, because the planning reforms are not going to be a game changer, but they're going to try to make the situation as encouraging as is humanly possible. And the changes in London, like now it's 20% affordable housing. And I mean, you mentioned Peckham. If this public inquiry, they lose, that will be actually 8% or 9% social housing in that scheme. They're going to tell them they don't have to build any affordable housing at all. So, yeah, I don't think the pendulum is anywhere near swinging to a more favourable scenario. It's going to take more. No,
but,
I mean, maybe, like you say, Beth, we'll talk about that later.
Well, she's got very interesting ideas, like basically predicated on realising how vulnerable they are, the sector. I think it's true. I think, you can say the same thing about things like water. The water, they sit there, they say they can't renationalise water because it would cost too much, but they're obviously, it would be very easy to just increase the regulatory burden on them until their shares aren't worth that much, and then buy them. It's easy for a government to do if they've got the... I'm saying it's easy. I mean, it's not that easy, because I just drafted an article. I'm not sure I'm going to publish it, but I said, well, the thing is, in lots of countries in the world, trying to take public assets back into public ownership gets you thrown out by the army, like back by the Americans and the CIA. So it's not it's not necessarily that easy on that level. But if you had a government who had the will, the mechanisms are there, and the mechanisms are there, and partly what we're indicating is the extent to which, well, these social forces, they remain hegemonic in the sense that they remain the social forces to which the political class can't imagine not deferring, like forever. but they're very vulnerable. That position is really vulnerable. Like it's very easy now for large sections of the public to see, well, you could just do this differently, and actually they're weak. They are quite weak in certain ways, and so I think there are opportunities, of course, but it's not going to happen without a significant political break. It's not going to happen without political leadership, which is decisively and explicitly deciding to make a historic break with the paradigms of the past 40 years, which obviously we're not going to get from the current government. But but there are rising political forces who do want that.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I was sat about as far away as could possibly be from that microphone there. I was just going to say on the Greater Manchester question, something else I find quite interesting about it, just in terms of the local flavour, is I think quite how planned and pre-planned this process was in Greater Manchester, which I think makes it, if not unique, then very unusual. Compared to, for example, I think a lot of the other financial capitals that ended up being in hubs for property investment, I would say historically that the financialisation, the liberalisation of financial markets in the mid-70s through to the 80s preceded the influx of money into property, and it was almost this organic sort of realisation, we're reinventing these deindustrialised urban centres as playgrounds for yuppies, and there's money in this. So that's the kind of the way around it was. Whereas Manchester was very conscious. Manchester had a deindustrialised urban centre, no financial services, no service industry, etc. at all. In fact, large areas of the city centre were completely derelict and, quite frankly, scary. And very, very consciously, from the 80s onwards, Manchester Council, particularly within the conurbation, deliberately aped what they saw as the London model and the model that following from certain different US cities, and very, very consciously cultivated this culture of inward international investment into the cities, which then really starts to take off in the mid to late 90s after the IRA bomb, and then by sort of 2010s is basically this unstoppable juggernaut that's just sort of motoring on. I just think it's an interesting reflection on it, and I also think it feeds back into what Jeremy was just saying before about the powerlessness of local authorities as well, because I've done a lot of work talking with a lot of the people who are kind of responsible for this process, and it's surprising how little kind of perspective a lot of them have on this, actually, what the mechanisms that they've actually set in play. And for an awful lot of them, there's this big psychological motivation here, which is that they find themselves in the 80s, as Isaac, you were saying in your book, they find themselves at the end of the 80s with a newly centralised state where very little powers, very little influence, lost a lot of their resources. And it's almost a case of the devil makes work for idle hands. It's like, what actually do we have the power or ability to do anymore? And what they found that they could do was, we can go and court a bunch of international investors and start creating investable propositions in the city centre. I just think it's an interesting part of the story around Manchester, which I think illuminates to a certain extent how whilst I completely agree with the structural theses around how these things all came about, there's a human sort of process involved in this as well, which has got a lot of different sort of psychological ends.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one, like, the planned nature of it and just how good they were at doing it. You know, like, you study this stuff and you're like, on their own terms, they were extremely good at marketing the city and, you know, using the limited powers they had available in this particular context to, you know, as you say, Charlie, like, plan out a new sort of city centre that people lived in that was heavily kind of rentierised. I mean, I think the rental stuff comes after the crash as well, like build to rent becomes much more prominent after that. Initially, there's a lot of kind of like loft apartments being sold off to people and stuff like that. But yeah, the psychological aspect as well, I think when I was writing the book, I really tried to like empathise with these people to some extent. It was like the actual crisis of Manchester's deindustrialisation in the 60s and 70s was phenomenal. And, you know, these people came out of that crisis. You know, a lot of them, their families were, you know, working class Mancunian families. And you know, they were smashed. The political opposition that they tried to mount in the mid-80s was smashed. And then exactly they come to this point at the end of the century where they kind of at the end of the decade where they kind of just go with the flow and become very, very good at like working the system that they've been set to them to their advantage. I think what, and Richard Leese, who kind of comes out of this and is the leader of the council from 96, so just before the IRA bomb, right up until 2022, 25 years. And when I've never met him or really spoken to him, but when you kind of get the sense from things that he says and people around him, that their psychology was kind of locked in that period of the 80s, that they were like, Manchester is still this great, unbelievable post-industrial catastrophe, and we just have to keep going and going and going, keep the machine running, get the money coming in, go to MIPIM, being extraordinarily creative in like the public-private partnerships that they create. I mean, one of the chapters of the book starts with this day in MIPIM where the then Chief Executive Councillor, Hal Bernstein, is on a podium with Gary Neville, and the council has set up a public-private partnership with Gary Neville to develop a property in the city centre just opposite from the town hall. And they're at MIPIM trying to get this money in to make it all happen. And I think there's a kind of mankness about like the whole thing that was going on as well. But yeah, the psychological thing of coming out of that moment and kind of riding through it, and almost like, there's almost a kitsch element to it, like the Mancunian city centre Christmas markets and the Bee, and they become, if you look at like what they do and some of the key personnel and their peculiar psychologies often, and the peculiar in the sense that they kind of come out of a very particular thing, like that really does colour it. And that I think is partly why the city is so fascinating to look at for this broader picture, because almost there are all these kind of local characteristics and stories and people and things, but there's also obviously this giant picture that we've kind of been talking about that is happening across the country. I think it's worth saying these points. And I think the weakness of local government, but also its kind of peculiar strengths in very specific parts, over planning, over land, over the ability to set up these public-private partnerships, is really that story of Manchester. Like the council is powerful in very small sections, but is also hugely constrained. I think that kind of analysis of the complexity of local government is often missing as well. MIPIM is, I don't know what the French is, but it's basically like the International Property Fair in Caen every year, where property developers and investors and local government, well, it became very, I assume it's still happening, but it became very, very popular in the kind of last decade that local governments would send and have their stalls and kind of, every council would have a stall and they'd host events and they'd seek investment for kind of these big strategic regeneration projects.
Hiya. I was just wondering if any of the panel had any views on this current issue with Section 106. I know there's loads of issues with housing associations not wanting to take them on due to capacity, issues with quality and kind of the long-term management. The government kind of set up this clearinghouse thing which isn't working. Now we've got this London package which is meant to speed up all this new development, but housing associations are sitting on their hands and aren't seeming to shift on that. So any views on that would be interesting.
Is that the 39 billion package?
No, there's been new measures announced recently between the GLA and MHDRG on like planning reforms. It's lowering the thresholds and design stuff.
Yeah, I think it's the latest iteration of Section 106 failing. Like Section 106, for those, does everyone know what Section 106 is? No. So Section 106 is a clause in planning legislation whereby through which developers are supposed to provide affordable housing. And it was introduced in the early 90s, in 1991, I believe, in planning legislation. And it meant that developers were supposed to reach agreements with local authorities to provide a percentage of affordable housing in all new developments, not just housing, also other infrastructure. And that percentage has always been incredibly contentious and fought over, and developers would work with housing associations to deliver this affordable housing. And as a mechanism for providing affordable housing, it's never worked properly. Like if you look at, there's a very famous graph of housing numbers from the Second World War to the present day, and you see, council housing, private sector, sort of roughly equal. Councils stopped building housing, fell off a cliff, and Section 106 just provided, about 10% of what was needed. So it's never worked. This latest round of issues with housing associations not taking on the affordable housing that developers have actually built. So, we've got these new schemes which, investors are not buying, Londoners are not buying the for sale homes, and housing associations don't want to have anything to do with the affordable housing. So, no aspect of it is working. So I don't know too much about the dynamics of it, other than the fact that, yet another disaster. And in terms of what, the mayor is offering developers, do you mean the threshold's the 20%? Is that what you were referring to? Yeah, well, so they've done a number. I mean, they've brought down the threshold. It was 35% affordable housing developers had to provide in their developments, but it's not even like what you might think affordable, because affordable is defined as 80% of market value. So there would be a section of affordable or shared ownership and some social rent, which is what we would think of as genuinely affordable. But because developers are not making any profits and are therefore refusing to build, they brought it down to 20%. And they've also said that they will call in controversial schemes like the Rye Lane development. And actually, there's just been this public inquiry over Berkeley Homes' proposals to build this ghastly thing in Rye Lane. This sort of thing, there won't be a public inquiry. They'll just say, go ahead, developer, build it. So I think it, everything that we've been talking about, it's just making it all a lot worse. But it's the sort of issue that really should be surfaced like far further than the housing press. There is this affordable housing, and housing associations aren't doing anything about it. That should be a major story. And it's actually a sort of quite niche story.
Do you want to pack your two questions together?
All right, a couple of things. Just around the idea of shifting the political will, because essentially that's core to any change in the story, is that the political will that changes. And I think that in order for that to happen, we really have to address the fact that the decision makers, so that is both elected representatives and officers, for the most part are ill-informed, economically illiterate, and know nothing about issues that are as straightforward in this room as housing tenure. So we've had planning meetings in our council where neither the officers or the councillors have even a cursory understanding of the difference between the different housing tenures. And so that as a sort of how we've got to try and find a way of getting people to have a clear narrative which is accurate about housing and about economic activity, so that when we're having conversations, I'm a housing activist and organiser, when we're having conversations with councillors, that they're not looking at a completely blank face when we're talking to them about these things, when they're not so easily seduced by the glossy nonsense of the developers who know nothing about our local area, We know they know nothing about our local area. They barely step foot into it, and yet they are the only people who have the ear of the local authority. And they... And the idea simply of something like investment, I think this is a very interesting word that we should always challenge, because it's not investment if all the profits are not going to this country even, let alone the local area. That's not an investment, that's an extraction. It's the opposite of an investment. And we need to be really clear about challenging that. When we're talking about affordable housing targets, we have to dig in on that as well, and we need to challenge it every time. I think we should be always saying, oh, so you're saying it's 80% unaffordable. That's what you're planning on building? Why are you planning on building 80% unaffordable housing? What's the point in that? We don't need any more unaffordable housing. So we sort of need to be really explicit and sort of about the language and the contest, so that our representatives and the people who are working in local government, who are supposed to be representing us as well, have a little more understanding of the contest and the fact that they have been seduced by the other side.
We need some of them here today.
Huh?
We need some of the councillors here today.
Well, we've got one in front of us. There we are.
I was like,
He might be on his own.
yeah, I was like, I am one of those illiterate, economically illiterate bastard councillors. No, I know. Firstly, I just want to pitch all these questions. Please ask them at the next session, all about development, all about Section 106, all about developers. I wanted to go back to rents. I want to ask a little bit about the strategy around the coalition necessary to hold the position that was, I think, from 2014 onwards, there was a huge amount of stepping forward in terms of the coalition around more social housing. People were angry about things that councils had done. And I think broadly, and I say this broadly, there was acceptance that the housing settlement was wrong, that something needs to be done about it. And what's been really scary over the last 5 years is that coalition is being really carved up. So you have the deregulation YIMBY movement, which is viciously attacking Section 106. But also we're kind of failing because we're making moral arguments again, which the left likes to do. All of my mates, of course they want to be landlords. Of course they do. You own something, you get money for it. Like, who doesn't want that? There's an obvious economic incentive if you're, broke. And the right online are pushing this so hard. Like, buy a rundown HMO, up in the north, buy a parcel of it with your mates, basically become a slum landlord, because that is seen as the only way to escape the situation that they're facing in the place where they're paying super high rents or living at home with their parents, right? So we're seeing our own coalition be divided, both at the sharper end by corporate interests, but also Reform and all these kind of charlatans online are pushing a very neoliberal, look out for yourself, otherwise you're going to be the sucker. The 1988 Housing Act, it's rent control. It all comes back to rent control. And I just don't understand why, and I say that, I'm a Labour councillor, you can all boo me at the next session, I'm up for it. But why there isn't a mass campaign in urban areas around rent control. It is a very normal social democratic policy that in this country, every time you raise it, 1,000 people will start screaming at you that you don't understand economics, but it works all around the world. And I think we just need to get serious about arguing and articulating for a serious rent control policy. I'd love to hear your views about rent control.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think there is going to be a campaign, a big national campaign launched around rent control next year. I think the London Renters Union have pulled together a group of organisations around this, including the Homes for Us Alliance, which me and Jackson's gone involved in. It's essential, and I think it's one of the missed parts of that 1988 Housing Act. I do think that the YIMBY thing. I mean, I kind of saw also in that kind of pandemic period that I mentioned at the start. Like, I saw the kind of the start of the mobilisation of a YIMBY narrative in Britain in the kind of online public sphere. groups like Priced Out suddenly popping up, and there was clearly money behind them and so on. And it's been a very clever strategy to split the coalition of a housing movement in the last decade, and it's one that was kind of totally foreseeable because the YIMBY movement in the States emerged as a response by developer capital to a tenants movement. So it's kind of like a classic playbook, and I think the fact that quite a large sections of bits of the left were kind of brought along with this thing was bad, but also I think the failure to push back against it was bad, and I think that's sort of a failure on all of us to some extent, but it's something that we need to get a grip of, because I do think that kind of housing movement that emerged in the second half of the 2010s did bring together that social, like I was talking about, I was talking to Stuart Hodkinson yesterday about all this, and the kind of Focus E15 as this kind of moment that really politicised me around housing, and Sweets Ray Resists and all these kind of estate campaigns that were happening in London in kind of the first half of the 2010s, which is obviously in your edition of City that you edited. That coalition, and then there was a kind of Generation Rent coalition that basically built LRU, and I think that there was something, they were kind of together, but there was never really the political work done to bind them properly into a wider coalition. I actually think in Manchester, in GMTU, our membership is much more broad across these two groups, and we've been, a lot of our focus has been on estate demolition campaigns. In one of our big campaigns been going on 8 years in Rochdale against RBH, just trying to demolish this large city centre housing association, housing estate. But it's a kind of, there's something about the political coalition of the housing movement that I think is not thought through properly, and there are these kind of contradictions within it, and there is not enough work done to build the kind of unifying analysis between these groups, and I think that has opened up for things like the YIMBY to start to separate different sections of it.
Yeah, can I just say something on the YIMBY thing, because I think it ties in with the lady behind you and the point about language. And I mean, I think the problem with the YIMBY thing is that it's a bit like affordable housing. Oh yeah, housing that's affordable. No, not really. YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, we want more housing. Well, actually, it is, as you said, a very well-funded movement which arose in response to, a sort of housing resistance movement. And it's an astroturfing movement, which, so-called community groups paid for by, pro-developer lobbies, pro-developer MPs, acting as if they are local grassroots groups, but, scratch beneath the surface, and, very often they're not. And it's shocking when people that you sort of think actually know what this is all about start advancing those arguments. And, they're quite sophisticated. So that's the territory where this is being fought. It's all smoke and mirrors. So we just need to be clear about what the YIMBY thing is. And then I just wanted to make just a really quick point about landlords, which I'm sure are going to be talked about a lot, for the rest of the day. But there are different kinds of landlords. And I think just we need to be clear about our definitions. The big corporate landlords and the big private equity players and the big build-to-rent players, who've become so prominent in Manchester, they're different from, your mate who might be wanting to become a landlord. I'm not saying, am I saying one's worse than the other? Yes, I kind of probably am, because it's just like scale and impact. So it's just, I think we just need to be aware that the landlord landscape is quite fragmented as well.
No, well, I agree with you guys. I mean, I think it's worth thinking about who YIMBY is aimed at as a discourse, because I think Aidan's question actually does focus on that, focus our minds on that, and I think YIMBY as a discourse is aimed specifically at I think more than anything, it's aimed at the constituency of middle class, home owning people who are anxious about their kids now, and they haven't got the incredibly low interest rates anymore. So they're potentially weak in their consent the ongoing kind of hegemonic arrangements, but it's very appealing to their it's very appealing to them to go, yeah, we just need, it's about supply and demand, isn't it? You just need to build more houses, don't you? It's very appealing to them. And so it's very important that work like Nick's book, which tries to specifically attack that and critique that, say, look, just building more houses won't solve the problem. But I think rent controls as a simple demand also, I think it is also appealing to that constituency. I think actually we don't necessarily have to, we do have to attack the YIMBY narrative when it's made, but I also think they are open to rent controls, that constituency. I mean, my imaginary kind of typical member of that constituency, they're quite sympathetic to YIMBY, but also if you say to them, okay, fine, build more houses, but we also need rent controls, don't we? They'll say, yeah. So I don't think. So I think there is absolutely scope for rent controls as a mass demand. I think it is only a matter of time, to be honest. I think it's largely a question of political leadership. Like it should all. It's largely a question of political leadership. I think that, broadly speak, if you look at it, it's one of those many issues. You look at opinion polls when you ask people, should there be rent controls? I think it's in the 70s. I think it's in the 70%. I think, like public support for the general idea. So yeah, it really should be. It should be a demand.